As many of you who watch this channel know, every so often I take a 2-week break and I get 4 guest creators in to do Tinfoil Tuesday and Flat Earth Friday for those 2 weeks. And that starts today on today's Tinfoil Tuesday with the guest creator, Viced Rhino. Now, Viced Rhino is going to have a look at answers in Genesis's creation basics. And believe it or not, the topic is whether rocks age slowly or quickly. One for the young earthers, I think, here. Away you go, Viced Rhino.
Thank you, Dan. Today, we're looking at a video that is part of a series that I semi-regularly dip into over on my channel. It's Answers in Genesis Canada's Creation Basics playlist. This is episode 43, titled, Do Rock Layers Accumulate Quickly or Slowly? So, let's take a look.
Do rock layers accumulate quickly or slowly?
That depends very much on the rock layer. Some layers, like chalk, require long periods of time to form because of how they are formed. Chalk is formed when marine organisms such as coccolithophores die. When they die, their remains will sink to the ocean or sea floor and form an ooze, which will accumulate over time. This organic ooze will form chalk if it is primarily made up of calcium carbonate, and will form diatomite if it is primarily made up of silica. The Cretaceous period was an ideal time for chalk formation because there were vast, warm inland seas. Warm seas are better than cold because calcium carbonate is more soluble in cold water and so would be less likely to accumulate as sediment, and the organisms that produce calcium carbonate tend to prefer warmer waters. But the organisms that make up chalk are incredibly tiny, and our chalk beds are incredibly vast. This necessitates long periods of time, as the sheer numbers of organisms that would have had to exist simultaneously in order to produce the amount of chalk that we have on the Earth is physically impossible. And this is just looking at one specific type of rock. There are other sedimentary rocks that share a similar origin, but with different organisms in different environmental conditions. Now, that said, there are also layers that can form very quickly. Anything put out by a volcano comes immediately to mind, but also other catastrophic events like mudslides and, yes, even sometimes floods.
Welcome to Creation Basics, where our goal is to make God's creation part of your everyday conversation.
Alternate working title: How to Be That Guy That Annoys All His Coworkers with the Religious Stuff That They Just Don't Care About 101.
And in today's episode, we're going to continue a series and feature number 3 of 10 instances where evolutionists have changed position on a major concept that's part of the creation-evolution controversy towards more of a creationist viewpoint.
So, I guess this is not going to be the typical scientists are always changing their minds on stuff video, but more of a science is finally starting to recognize creation as valid video. Gee, I sure would like to see what it is that is convincing scientists that creation could actually be a valid theory.
Now, please understand, I'm not saying that they've switched to believe in biblical creation over an evolutionary story.
Oh, well, that's disappointing to say the least.
I'm just highlighting this to show you that science is revealing creationist interpretations of facts that we see in God's world are better understood according to God's word.
I have my doubts about that. I feel like if there were accurate scientific information in the Bible, then at some point in history, the reading of the Bible would have led to a scientific discovery of some kind.
So, today's example is large-scale catastrophes in geology.
Oh, so you're thinking more of the transition from catastrophism to uniformitarianism that includes catastrophes. Well, perhaps a bit of history on geologic thought would be helpful here. You see, while religion did heavily influence our view of science well into the 18th and 19th centuries, the debate between uniformitarianism and catastrophism that occurred in the 1800s was not religiously motivated, though theologians certainly preferred one model over the other. The catastrophic model that was being argued for was one that involved many large-scale, rapid, cumulative changes that would end in a rather sudden collapse, after which the cycle would begin begin again. Yes, religious leaders would point to the global flood as an event that initiated the latest sudden collapse, but this was not the main thrust of the position. In the uniformitarian view, catastrophes that we witness during our lifetime, hurricanes for instance, are relatively minor when viewed from the geologic timescale. But should there be a regular hurricane season with repeated hurricanes for long periods of time, then that process will produce certain geologic features. What Calvin is likely referring to here is the fact that over the past 40 to 50 years or so, geologists have come to view large catastrophes as being potentially more impactful on geologic processes than they were thought to be in the past. And what exactly are these catastrophes? They are found in the mass extinction events of the past 570 million years. There can be no doubt that the asteroid impact that killed off the non-avian dinosaurs permanently and drastically altered the geology of the Earth, both in depositing a global layer of iridium and in completely changing the makeup of organisms that would be found fossilized for the rest of the history of the planet.
And our question is, does science support slow or rapid deposition and accumulation of rock layers?
A little of column A, a little of column B. Catastrophic uniformitarianism.
Now, you might remember being taught in school that, sedimentary rock layers, the ones with those fine layers supposedly got laid down slowly, 1 or 2 incredibly fine layers per year until they added up to the massively thick layers we see all around the world.
What you're referring to here is a very specific process known as lamination. Not all sedimentary rock comes in laminae, and not all laminae are sedimentary. Metamorphic rock can have laminae as well, though the process by which sedimentary rock and metamorphic rock become laminated are quite different. To oversimplify, a lamination in sedimentary rock is really just a thin layer of strata. The definitions aren't set in stone, pun intended, but generally it is a layer of less than 1 centimeter thick, whereas a stratum is a layer of more than 1 centimeter thick and may contain multiple laminae. But more to the point, the process of lamination requires calm waters, which is a really neat trick to pull off in a global catastrophic turbulent flood.
And of course, this was supposedly one of the main evidences that convinced geologists that the world wasn't roughly 6,000 years old as the Bible teaches.
It wasn't laminae that did the trick. The concept of an old Earth actually began with Steno's laws of stratigraphy when applied to the fossil record. As Robert Hooke commented in the 1600s, the fossil record could form the basis for a chronology that would far antedate even the very pyramids. In the 18th century, large-scale canal building started happening, and it was noted during the digging of these canals that these stratigraphic layers could be correlated over great distances. But in some cases, there was evidence of missing layers, or unconformities. These unconformities showed that the deposition process must have been interrupted, and were often accompanied by long periods of erosion or tilt. So really, it was a combination of the fossil record, Steno's laws of stratigraphy, the correlation of distant strata, and unconformities that led to the conclusion that the Earth is in fact old.
Of course, biblical creationists have always argued that the vast majority of those layers got laid down during the Great Flood recorded in Genesis 6-9.
Yes, they have. Unfortunately for them, they are demonstrably wrong. Not only do we have this information on how long it takes some of the layers to form, but we also have several individual depositional environments that would just not be possible in a flood situation, like aeolian deposits, that is, deposition that is caused by wind in an arid environment. Glacial deposition, from glaciers, obviously. Not to mention the evaporate deposits. Evaporate deposits are deposits that form when water flows into a basin with limited drainage, where the inflow of water is slower than the rate of evaporation, causing the precipitation of evaporative salts like halite. What's more, with the salts, we can often see laminae that are indicative of annual cycles. Water evaporates quicker in the warm summer months, with an influx of more water during the cooler, wetter season, leading to less evaporation. In addition to that, certain salt beds have been observed to have cycles ranging from 11-year cycles all the way up to 180-year cycles. So yes, if we just look at the big picture from a bird's eye view and ignore the details, it can superficially look like all of this might have been caused by a flood. Most depositional environments do involve water after all, so there is a certain intuitive appeal, but as soon as you start learning any of the details about how these different depositional environments operate, we find that a worldwide flood is simply not a good explanation for any of it.
So it must have happened fairly quickly.
Yeah, you just go ahead and try to get an evaporative deposit as big as the Michigan salt mines to hurry up and happen within a year. Keep in mind that the salts in the Salina Formation, found throughout much of eastern North America, which includes the Michigan salt mines, are not just one top layer of salts that could have formed as the floodwaters evaporated. There are several other sedimentary layers on top of them, and they themselves are often found to alternate between carbonate sedimentary rocks and evaporative salts, demonstrating that they could not have formed in one singular event.
Now, at one time, any mention of catastrophism pertaining to geologic processes was largely mocked and ridiculed as religious, and it was unscientific in the mainstream geologic community, which almost unanimously conformed to the views of a man named Charles Lyell.
Well, I can't confirm this one way or the other, but considering the fact that catastrophism was not argued religiously but rather scientifically in the 1800s, my default assumption here would be that it was a respectable position that eventually lost out as the evidence against it became more apparent. And then, as we collected even more data, it became apparent that some catastrophes could, in fact, have a geologic impact in one singular event, and that such catastrophes were not as rare as was once thought, leading to the development of catastrophic uniformitarianism. This does not give any extra credibility to the flood model. To quote Roy Lemon on the matter, to upgrade the importance of catastrophes as geologic agents should not be construed as giving aid and comfort to fundamentalist doctrines which today still seek to promote a catastrophic view of Earth history. Such absurd ideas are now appearing in the guise of quote-unquote scientific writings of creationist theorists and others. The works typically contain large numbers of references and quotations from the standard literature, and because such references are always meticulously acknowledged, there is, to the lay reader, the implication that the author of the particular work quoted supports the quote-unquote facts described. Now, he wrote that over 30 years ago, and here sits Calvin of Answers in Genesis, presenting this idea as though it is a brand new development in 2020. I guess creationists really don't have any new arguments.
Who wrote a book in the early 1800s that championed uniformitarianism, the idea that the present is the key to the past.
Yes. Now, I did point out earlier that catastrophism was argued for on scientific grounds rather than on religious grounds, but it is also worth pointing out that Lyell may have had certain anti-creationist biases that made him a bit more eager than was necessarily proper to prove uniformitarianism at the expense of catastrophism, which may have been a contributing factor to the complete disregard for catastrophism that happened over the next century or so. It is important to recognize that scientists are not perfect and often have biases when they work. That is why the peer review process is so important to science. It allows several objective appraisals of the work to make sure the biases of the scientists are not having an undue impact. Of course, this process is not perfect, but it is the best we have, and it has given us unprecedented scientific progress over the last couple centuries.
He argued that the rates of deposition we see in lakes and rivers and oceans in the present must have always been.
Not so much that they must have always been, but that we see no mechanism that would make them substantially faster or slower in the past, and that there's no reason to assume that such a mechanism is at work without first seeing evidence of said mechanism.
And so this is how the sedimentary layers, containing fossils we see all over the world must have been laid down.
Yes, we see the processes that lead to these kinds of layers happening today, and we see no reason to think the same processes weren't working in the past. Wind blows grains of sand the same today as it did yesterday. Rivers carry dissolved minerals the same today as they did yesterday. When a coccolithophore dies today, its skeleton sinks to a warm, calm ocean's floor the same as it did yesterday. Why should we assume that these sorts of things worked differently in the past?
And no matter how much creationists have pointed out to what they consider obvious evidence that vast sections of the Earth's rock layers must have been formed quickly during, a catastrophic flood.
As mentioned, the superficial view of geology can kinda sorta look that way if you tilt your head just right. But as soon as you learn the details about the environments which form the different strata, you realize that a global flood is not only not indicated, but it is not possible.
Things like polystrate fossils, for example.
Taking bets now on whether or not the only examples he can think of are trees.
Which are basically fossils, like trees that extend through meters of sediment.
Called it. Yes, trees. Do you know why the only type of polystrate fossil that creationists can come up with are trees? Because trees are the only category of organism that can stand for sometimes hundreds of years after they die. Remember earlier when I pointed out that sometimes layers can form quickly, and sometimes they form slowly depending on the different type of layer? Well, fun fact about polystrate trees, they are only ever found in the midst of depositional layers that are known to be deposited rather rapidly, such as sand and mud deposition from a levee breach. What's more, conventional geological explanations for how these trees ended up as they are have remained largely unchanged since John William Dawson published his explanation for the trees he found in Joggins, Nova Scotia in 1868. And just as another little fun fact, all of the layers surrounding these polystrate trees have other fossilized plants in them, complete with root systems, meaning that there had to have been enough time between the deposition of the sediment and its lithification for new plants to begin growing before the next layer was deposited. So yeah, the dead trees were not standing for thousands to millions of years after they died, waiting for the slow accumulation of rock layers around them, but even though it happened rapidly from a geological perspective, it still happened way too slowly for the creationist flood story to be an adequate explanation.
So we're obviously buried quickly, not slowly.
Quickly, yes, but still far too slowly for you.
I mean, no matter how much this and much more evidence was shown, creationists were basically shunned and banned from secular science journals.
The final sentence of Dawson's book, where he explained the formation of these upright fossil trees, as they are more properly called, is, "Patient observation and thought may enable us in time to better comprehend these mysteries, and I think we may be much aided in this by cultivating an acquaintance with the maker and ruler of the machine as well as with his work." Make of that what you will, but don't you dare claim that these very religious geologists of the 19th century were trying to just find a way to discredit the Bible.
Because of the connection to the flood account written by Moses in the Bible.
If you are going to base your scientific conclusions on the assumption that an event happened when that event demonstrably did not happen, then yes, you will be shunned from the scientific community, and rightfully so.
And this was obviously Lyell's goal in the first place. I mean, how do we know that? Well, he actually admitted that his chief goal was to, quote, "free the science of geology from Moses," in one of the letters that he wrote.
Yes, as I already pointed out, Lyell was biased in that way. But he was one geologist out of many, with the majority making statements similar to the one that I quoted earlier from Dawson. That is hardly the damning evidence that you seem to think it is.
You know, Lyell was a trained lawyer and in opposition to the biblical account and argued against the idea of Noah's flood having laid down the rocks and fossils.
Yes, and he argued successfully. So successfully that his model was the basis for a good chunk of modern geology. The thing is, had he been wrong, scientists would have figured out that he was wrong, and they have on a number of topics. Yes, he was a lawyer, but legal arguments are not how we determine which scientific hypotheses are correct. His ideas, while argued for masterfully, stand today on their merits, not on the rhetoric with which they were originally argued.
But you know, today, the facts have become so obvious in favor of certain rock formations having been formed by rapid deposition that many evolutionists have admitted it and have switched to what's now called Neo-Catastrophism, New Catastrophism.
Well, the textbook that I've been using has dubbed it Catastrophic Uniformitarianism. It was authored in 1990 though, so maybe it's out of date. But upon doing some cursory Googling, I have found that Neo-Catastrophism is the hypothesis that events that result in the sterilization of solar systems, like gamma-ray bursts, have acted to suppress the development of complex life in the habitable zone of our galaxy as a proposed explanation of Fermi's paradox. I feel like that doesn't really have a whole lot to do with geology. I have also found that the term catastrophic uniformitarianism hasn't seemed to have caught on, although now the explanations for uniformitarianism pretty much universally all have a caveat that geologists understand that infrequent catastrophic events can have important consequences in geologic history.
One of the first was the professor of geology at the University College of Swansea, Derek Ager, he's now deceased, who said about polystrate fossils, "We have allowed ourselves to be brainwashed into avoiding any interpretation of the past that involves extreme and what might be termed catastrophic processes. We cannot escape the conclusion that sedimentation was at times very rapid indeed."
I have never, not once, ever seen a geologist deny that sedimentation can be rapid. In fact, let's go back to the textbook by Roy Lemon that I've been using as a reference for some of this. This is figure 1.1. It is the first visual aid that you come across in the book, and it is found on page 5. Let's read the description, shall we? Sediment accumulation can be extremely rapid, as seen at this Pennsylvanian section of Nova Scotia, where a large tree trunk was buried in sediment before it had time to rot away. Now, the quote that Calvin is using in particular, I might add, was contained in a book that was being written during the period where the thinking in geology was in the process of transitioning from a purely uniformitarian view to that of catastrophic uniformitarianism. You can imagine which side of the debate Professor Ager was on. It's actually interesting to me to see the transition happening. His book was originally published in 1973, when the catastrophic view of geology was largely being ignored. So you can see that his language is more combative, but in the book that I've been using from 1990, it's presenting it as though it is an argument that is mostly over. People now recognize the importance of catastrophes, but we still need to acknowledge that there was a time in recent history when this importance was not recognized. But now, 30 years later, it's basically a given that what we call uniformitarianism also includes the knowledge of occasional geologically significant catastrophes. But creationists don't like that. They want the geologists to be fighting against their specific catastrophe, so they go ahead and quote books that are almost 50 years out of date as though they are speaking to the current situation.
And by the way, Ager was no friend of creationists.
Which makes you wonder, why would someone who is not a creationist feel comfortable saying something like that? Could it be that when you actually look at the data, it shows that yes, sometimes catastrophes can affect the geologic record, and that yes, sometimes sedimentation can occur rapidly, but that none of this actually points to one single global flood 6,000 years ago? In fact, let me quote Professor Ager from the very same book that you quoted him in. In case this book should be read by some fundamentalist searching for straws to prop up his prejudices, let me state categorically that all my experience, such as it is, has led me to an unqualified acceptance of evolution by natural selection as a sufficient explanation for what I have seen in the fossil record.
But it seems many modern Earth scientists are rather, unkind to Lyell's ideas now.
That's how science works. If an idea does not adequately explain the data, then we look for a new idea. We don't massage the data until it fits. Unkind might be a bit of a mislabel, though. I imagine most geologists recognize the importance of Lyell's contribution, even if some of them turned out to not be entirely correct.
No less than Warren D. Ullman, the director of the Paleontological Research Institution of Ithaca, New York, and the adjunct associate professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Cornell University, said the following, quote, Lyell also sold geology some snake oil. He convinced geologists that all past processes acted at their current rates, that is, those observed in historic time. And this extreme gradualism has led to numerous unfortunate consequences, including the rejection of sudden or catastrophic events in the face of positive evidence for them, for no reason other than they were not gradual.
Now, in a shock to no one, this quote was published in the early 90s, which seems to be the tail end of the debate that led to geologists' general acceptance of catastrophes as potential geologic events. Yes, you can find scientists engaged in a discussion of the merits of catastrophes during a time when it was beginning to be recognized that catastrophes have a geologic impact. Now, I found it helpful to keep in mind during this that the Alvarez hypothesis, which is the idea that the asteroid is what killed the dinosaurs and left us with a global iridium layer, was only proposed in 1980, which is right in the middle of this debate between pure uniformitarianism and catastrophic uniformitarianism. We all kind of take it for granted now that yes, an impact like the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs obviously had a geologic impact, but when it was initially proposed, it was a controversial idea. In fact, Professor Ager, champion of catastrophes though he was, rejected the Alvarez hypothesis. I don't know, I find it fascinating to look back through some of the older literature to watch the ongoing debate, the result of which is largely settled today. But it always looks weird to me when creationists will bring up this old and settled debate and try to present it as though the losing side won, but there are still some maverick scientists out there who are willing to go to bat for what in reality is the winning side, but is being presented as some sort of underdog.
Wow. An idea that convinced many Christians the earth was millions of years old is now called snake oil by modern Evolutionists.
No, the idea that catastrophes couldn't possibly have had any impact at all was called snake oil some 30 years ago.
Christians should have believed the Bible.
That's the conclusion you're drawing from that? I think we should start a charity or something that teaches creationists how to read a whole book sometime instead of just select passages. I don't even mind if they apply it to the Bible as well. Might do them some good.
Again, this doesn't mean that secular geologists have embraced the concept of a global flood.
Which then leaves us with the question, why not? They clearly want to follow the evidence where it leads. They're not treating Lyell's ideas with undue reverence, being able to criticize him harshly at times, as you have shown. So if the evidence actually pointed to a global flood, why would they deny it?
They believe now that there were many large floods, not just one big one.
And since flooding is something that we still see happening regularly today, why is this an issue? As I pointed out, there are so many different depositional environments, most of which have nothing to do with flooding, and these environments can often be found in rock layers that are in between flood events. Given these different environments, it makes a lot more sense that there would have been local flooding, large and small, rather than one global flood.
But it does show that catastrophism is evident in geology and how the philosophical bias against the Bible blinded science to obvious conclusions for many years.
Nah, it wasn't a philosophical bias against the Bible, it was just that the evidence didn't back up the Bible. And that's it for this one. If you like what you saw, consider subscribing both to myself and Simon Dan. Links for social media, Patreon, and my sources are all in the description. Dan, back to you.